Hello, and welcome to The Source. In episode 3 of the series, we get to grips with data quality and the importance of metadata retention. Having complete communications data is important for compliance, but quantity doesn't always beat quality. Having access to the right data and metadata in the right format that's easily sourceable and searchable can improve surveillance and eDiscovery outcomes and make all the difference between good regulatory relations or being told to clean up your act. On this episode, I'm joined by Garrett Chow, Director of Commercial Operations at Global Relay. Thanks for joining us today, Garrett. For the benefit of our audience, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what your role at Global Relay involves?
Yeah, definitely. And thanks for having me, Jay. So my career's been exclusively in the tech space. Going back just a little more than 10 years is when I really got my first taste in the industry with a few Vancouver-based startups. But coming to Global Relay, that really was my first taste of reg tech and compliance. I worked in the product management side of the business, so that was a great opportunity for me to learn how the systems worked. It was eye-opening, to be frank, because I saw how building compliance technology is completely different from most B2B solutions. And I then did a number of years in external facing roles, so managing key accounts, implementing solutions. And that was important for me to understand practical issues that firms face in compliance on a day-to-day basis. And that kind of brings me to my role today, where I'm focused on building our presence in EMEA. And we've seen a massive growth over the last 5 years. We have just over 500 people in our London office. And shortly later this year, we'll be expanding into Stockholm. So exciting times ahead.
Exciting indeed. And it sounds like you've got a great range of experience that includes a lot of boots on the ground views of kind of products and the challenges that compliance professionals have when it comes to wrangling data. On that, we see what feels like a new record-keeping or off-channel communications case from regulators, seems like once a week, where firms don't have complete communications data. Why do you feel it's important for firms to prioritize data quality when capturing their communications?
Well, I think the obvious answer is, of course, it's a regulatory requirement for firms to have complete books and records and ultimately so that they can remain compliant. Now, of course, it's easy for me to sit in the vendor seat and state that everything needs to be captured. But in reality, there's a practical cost of compliance, and ultimately that influences decision making. And so when I talk to firms, the question that I often hear isn't do you have a solution to capture X platform, but rather do I have to capture X? So when you look at record keeping, not only are there new channels coming into the picture every day, but existing channels, they're extending their feature sets and giving end users more tools to collaborate. So let me give you an example, right? Zoom. So Zoom historically was a web conferencing tool, but it's evolved to the point where it's a true unified communications platform. So it offers things like polling and phone capabilities and whiteboards and the list goes on. So what does that mean from a capture perspective? Well, it means that firms need to consider several things. To me, there's 3 key points. Number one, how is the data being captured? So are they leveraging official platform APIs and going directly to vendors versus scraping methods, right? Are they relying on unauthorized third-party solutions? So it's really important that you understand the methods in which capture is done. For example, do new releases of the source platform break your connector anytime there's a change? So capture really, to me, can't just be a tick box exercise, and it very much has to be a quality over quantity situation. So next is data formatting. Is the data captured and structured in a consistent format that preserves the native attributes of whatever the said specific channel is? Or does it get flattened into an email body? And ultimately, that format, that impacts how the data is organized, how you want to leverage it for search and eDiscovery. And I think that's something that gets overlooked quite often is the user experience. So if you're looking at a poorly formatted data set that resembles something like a notepad file, it's extremely painful, right? And when you're in the compliance seat, you're investigating thousands of messages trying to find something of relevance. So last but certainly not least, firms, they have to consider support and maintenance model, whether they're managing that capture in-house or through a vendor. So are the resources that you have, are they able to support building new connectors that are coming into the market every day, such as TikTok or Reddit as the needs come up? But do they have the ability to maintain the existing ones, right? So what I mean by that, and an example I like to use, is when Elon Musk, he purchased Twitter, right? So he bought Twitter, and he made some immediate changes, not only from a headcount perspective, but he made a lot of technology changes to their business API. And so from a compliance perspective, every vendor that connected to their business API had to update their technology to reflect those changes. So it's extremely important that whatever the means of capture, you have the appropriate resources and expertise to support the capture of your communications.
Sure, I think, as ever, a substantial balancing act for compliance professionals. There's a lot of things they need to consider, a lot of actions they need to take. And as you say, it's both about making sure they're staying on top of emerging channels, but also considering their legacy and ongoing channels as well.
Yeah, it's definitely not just a pure technology situation.
Absolutely. So you mentioned the importance of data quality there. How can firms ensure that the data they're capturing is high quality? What tests or checks or workflows can they put in place?
Well, it's a lot of things that I mentioned before. So what happens when we talk to firms is that many times they will look at X platform, and it'll be very much a checkbox exercise, right? So they'll go through the exercise and they'll look at the market and understand, well, what technologies are available, and then they kind of make the choice, and often a tactical decision based on price, right? So just kind of reiterating the things that I mentioned previously, understanding how are those platforms getting captured, and you have to look at the maturity of the said platform, especially within financial services and from a compliance perspective. So what I often tell firms is you want to have a bit of a maturity matrix on the comms used within your firm, to be able to meet compliance requirements. So an example that I always like to use is if you look at Microsoft Teams, when that first came onto the market, Slack was kind of the dominant collaboration enterprise platform, but then Teams started getting adopted everywhere, especially within financial services. But Microsoft, their focus, at least from a revenue perspective, isn't financial services. Their focus on user adoption, enterprise collaboration, their focus really isn't compliance. So when Teams first came out, there was a lot of challenges in their APIs in order to capture the data. And of course, it's improved since then. They've made a number of changes to their API that allow for compliance to meet their requirements from a capture perspective. But the same thing is kind of what we're seeing with channels like WhatsApp today, right? WhatsApp, again, they're not focused on regulatory compliance. They're focused on marketing, advertising, user communication, not necessarily those compliance needs. So it's kind of important to do an assessment of what are the platforms that you have in use, and get your front office to attest as to what that set of communications is. And then doing a bit of an assessment on where do these platforms lie from a compliance maturity perspective.
For sure. I think it's interesting that you use Teams as an example, because I understand that platforms like Teams are always evolving their user experience and adding more features, which is great for users. But for compliance professionals, it kind of results in the goalposts being moved in terms
Definitely.
of ensuring they can capture that data. So they need to make sure that the solutions they're employing are fleet of foot enough to be able to adapt to those changes. So digital communications channels, as we all know, produce a lot of data. They also produce a lot of metadata, such as files, attachments, things like the send times of messages and the names or contact details of their senders. Why is it vital that firms capture metadata and that it's retained alongside their communications data?
Yeah, so metadata, it's extremely important because it provides context, right? If the contents of a book is the data, then the cover is the metadata, right? And with electronic communications, it's about who said what when. And if you take that a little bit deeper, the core pieces of metadata, they can act as a launching pad for further enrichment, for search, reporting. There's a lot of downstream benefits from good metadata. So an example that I like to use is how I used to manage my music library. Right. So when I was in high school, everyone had an iPod, including myself. But the thing is, you had to manage your music library in iTunes and sync it with your iPod. And if you ever have seen the Apple keynotes that Steve Jobs used to give, his onstage demos, they were a complete masterclass in sales. And when they launched the iPod, well, it was the iPod Touch at the time, he gave this demo where he flips his iPod onto landscape mode, and he starts scrolling through the entire music library as it's displayed with its album art and the covers and everything like that. And I remember him swiping through and saying, and now I can go into cover flow and you can see the gorgeous album art, and it's a revelation in how you enjoy your music. And I just remember watching that and thinking, right, take my money right now. But in order to have the user experience that Steve described, your library, it had to be meticulously organized, and it had to have all the correct metadata, so things like the artist name, the album date, cover art, etc., etc. But the problem is I couldn't afford the 99 cents that they were asking per song because I was a broke teenager. And so if you remember platforms like Napster and LimeWire, everyone was using these pirating platforms. But the problem is that the stuff that you would download from these platforms often was just complete garbage, and especially from a metadata perspective, you'd always get incorrect spelling of artist names, and the capitalization would be wrong, or the album art would be some kind of weird janky image that somebody created in Photoshop. So I never could quite get the revolutionary experience that Apple wanted. And how does this tie back to comms data? So when you're not talking about 1,000 songs, right? You're talking about millions, in some case, billions of messages. And so you can start to see how ensuring the right metadata is captured and preserved, it's critical. And then also having the right tools to find and target the proverbial needle in the haystack, especially in eDiscovery and surveillance scenarios. So like I mentioned before, the way in which you're capturing the data is critical. Are you getting your songs from Napster, or are you getting them from the iTunes store?
I would quite happily dedicate the rest of this podcast to discussing millennial nostalgia around iTunes maintenance, but we need to stay on topic. What would you say the major challenges are for firms in capturing their business communications data and metadata at scale, and how can they overcome these challenges?
So I think if you talk to every single regulated firm, they will absolutely tell you that it's their intention to be compliant. But the world of comms data, it's become incredibly complicated, and I do empathize with firms who are trying to stay on top of their regulatory commitments. And you have to understand that comms record keeping and monitoring, it's just one sliver of the overall responsibilities that compliance professionals have. So to me, it's a complete no-brainer that firms should emphasize simplicity in their technology stacks so that they can sift through the noise, make the right decisions. And from a technology perspective, you have vendors for archiving, for surveillance, for data connectors, for legal hold retention management, the list goes on. But the train doesn't unfortunately stop there. It extends to category, right? So you have archiving vendors for e-coms, and you have an archiving vendor for voice. You have data connectors for mobile and data connectors for social media. So I think you get the picture. And what you end up with is this complete dog's breakfast of 20, 30 different solutions that result from tactical decisions, limited budgets. So then you go and you try to implement a strategic solution like AI, right? But you have this complete mess of a web of different technologies, each with their own capture methodologies, data structure, support model. So you can kind of see how consistency and simplicity is key and paramount for firms to achieve the legal and compliance requirements. And although there's certainly benefits, I'm not saying that firms need to have a single vendor for everything. But at a minimum, firms should strive for a single record-keeping store for all their comms data, covering both regulated and unregulated populations. And that supports downstream dependencies like aforementioned surveillance solutions. And they really should work with vendors that have the ability to meet their capture needs today, but also yesterday for historical data, and tomorrow as new platforms emerge.
I think it's all too easy for firms and their compliance teams to end up in that situation where they have maybe a legacy tech stack. They're trying to keep on top of emerging as well as legacy channels, and they end up with, as you say, a dog's breakfast of different capture and archiving channels and solutions. And integration just becomes such a challenge to keep on top of. And as much as we all hope for seamless integration between all of our solutions, we know it's not always that easy. And that can become as much of a challenge as managing the data flow. So besides making it easier and faster for firms to cooperate with investigations when the regulators come calling, what other benefits do you feel ensuring data quality has for businesses?
Yeah, generally speaking, firms, they need to address their immediate risks, and that covers your usual compliance and legal use cases. So for many reasons that I've mentioned previously, improved search and eDiscovery, ability to pinpoint surveillance policies, filter out noise, but also consider where do your use cases, where can they extend beyond legal and compliance, right? So the common sentiment that I hear is that compliance spend is increasing. Firms want more ROI from their vendors. And unsurprisingly, there are many valuable insights that you can derive from your comms data. So if you take off your compliance and legal lens for a second, and you can aggregate all of your comms data in one place, you have this wonderful repository of things like your company history, for example, or how employees behave and interact, or a network of the relationships inside and outside your firm. So just look at it for what it is. It's communications data. There's a ton of valuable insights in that. And the benefits can go beyond the traditional stakeholders in legal and compliance. But a lot of firms don't really think about their data in that way, and they fall into these tactical approaches. And my encouragement is look at your data from a strategic perspective, outside of your one or two traditional use cases.
So you mentioned it earlier. It's kind of the elephant in the room in terms of discussing tech and certainly compliance technology. Artificial intelligence is very much the hottest topic across the compliance space right now. Many are weighing up the potential risks, the potential rewards that it can offer, and regulators are getting their ducks in a row in terms of how they're going to regulate potential AI technology. Do you think that high quality data and metadata is going to be important to securing the best AI outcomes for firms?
Well, I had a feeling that you were going to ask me this, Jay, so I have to have a good answer here. Well, so firstly, I think we're very much in the early days of AI, and I think most people will agree with me that its adoption in the compliance sphere is inevitable. But to me, it's not entirely clear what that will look like just yet. And the entire AI space is just moving at such a rapid pace. So if you look at generative AI models like DALL-E and Midjourney that create images from a text prompt. When they first launched, the output was just passable to the point where you could just decipher what the image was about, but the person looked like a paint blob or had 7 fingers or some issue like that. But in less than 18 months, the pictures that these models are generating are almost indistinguishable from real life. And not only are we seeing that in images, but we're now seeing text to video models come to life and enter the market. So it's evolving at a rapid pace. If I kind of bring this a little bit closer to our space, if you look at something like OpenAI, they just released their ChatGPT 4o model, which can do real-time translation and dictate and reason with different emotions. And so as a result, everyone inside and outside of the compliance sphere is scrambling to figure out how to leverage AI. But the pace of innovation to me is moving faster than the pace of implementation, right? So for compliance workflows, my perspective is a little bit more practical and less sexy than the audience may want to hear. But right now, I think we're kind of in the midst of this quote unquote model war, right? And who has the biggest and baddest model? But instead, I actually think that the battle is going to be won in the factory. So you can have a world-class F1 driver, but if you don't have a world-class racing vessel, then you're going to have problems. And what we know for a fact is that AI is a high compute exercise, and ultimately that means it's a highly capital-intensive activity as well. So firms have to consider and look at the economic longevity, but also the horsepower needed behind these mind-blowing results that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis. So data management, scalability, processes, data privacy, explainability, all of these things, they're key factors that are critical, but they don't make for a good AI headline, right? And if I answer your question point blank about about AI and high data quality, yes, I think it's incredibly important for good AI outcomes. Having high quality structured data means AI can perform more efficiently, especially from an economic perspective, but also more accurately because it's not having to analyze things that are irrelevant to the task. And going back to the hardware story, right? So better models are coming out every day, and you have to consider the modularity of your infrastructure to leverage them and back them. Or if you're building your own, you have to kind of question if that's the winning formula, right? And ultimately, I think that's going to come down to use cases and cost.
As with all questions around AI, it raises perhaps more questions than answers. And it'll be interesting to see over the coming years how much that buzz around AI is maintained, because it feels like a very short amount of time ago, maybe only 2 or 3 years, that we were having similar conversations around the metaverse, which I'm sure some of our listeners might remember as being the next big thing.
I mean, there's a lot going on, but at the same time, I think it is an exciting time to be in, especially in the compliance space, and the stuff that you see happening in the retail and consumer markets, with ChatGPT and things like that. There's no doubt that there is some cross benefit within the compliance space, but how does that happen? I think the jury's still out, even though we have ideas of what that's going to look like. But definitely exciting times ahead.
For sure. And as a content professional, I have no concerns at all. So we kind of touched on it briefly as part of the last question, but what role do you think AI will play in future eDiscovery and surveillance workflows specifically?
eDiscovery and surveillance workflows. Well, I think the natural answer is around reducing false positives and identifying the specific risks. But I think it kind of goes beyond that. So you're starting to see these really, really big large language models with billions of parameters enter the financial services space, and there's a bit of debate around is it specific enough to our industry, how traders and front office people speak and the lingo that they use, and it's not entirely clear how good or how effective that these models are. So I think one thing that isn't always talked about is how the structure of the data is happening, benefiting from AI. So we often throw a piece of or throw a message to the model and ask it to come up with an outcome, but what are we feeding the model is equally as important. And I think that's where AI can play a big part, especially in messaging data. So what typically happens in a model training scenario is that you have to understand the specific properties, the specific attributes of given message. So a Teams message, we keep talking about that, it's going to look and feel different than a voice message, right? And the same thing's going to it's going to happen with a social media post, a LinkedIn post, for example. So understanding the nuances and the specific properties and attributes of each of these messages is challenging, right? And if you're a data scientist, you have to, in a way, develop expertise in each of these platforms, and then you start scaling that and expanding it by in some cases 50 over 100 different channels that's used within a large bank, for example. So I think that's where AI can really play a role, is structuring these different types of messages and breaking it down into manageable chunks such that the models, they don't have to overwork and look at the entire message. It can really pinpoint and just look at what's relevant. So I think that's going to be key in building these AI models going forward, and how we're going to leverage them for compliance in the financial services industry.
So we've kind of touched on how, as a compliance professional, you need to be aware of not just present risks and challenges, but also those of the past and the future as well. So with that in mind, what do you see as the biggest potential challenge for firms when it comes to capturing and leveraging high quality data through to the end of 2024?
So I think one of the biggest overlooked challenges is procurement. So just forget AI for a second. If you look at the technology communications landscape over the last few years, it's constantly evolving, constantly moving, changing, right? It is a bit of a moving target, like you said, Jay. And yesterday, the standard for messaging was texting, but today it's WhatsApp, and enterprise collaboration started with things like WebEx and GoToMeeting, but now everyone's on Teams, right? Teams, Slack, etc. And so I haven't even started talking about iPhones and Androids and the whole mobile space, or voice recording. Right? I think that's, as many compliance professionals may agree with me, is possibly what's coming next in terms of the next phase of regulatory attention. And so, similar to what I was mentioning earlier about having this dog's breakfast and sea of vendors and different solutions, it becomes extremely laborious, but also cost intensive as an undertaking each time that you need to go out to market and buy a new surveillance solution or a new connector for TikTok 2.0 when it comes out. So if you just think about the high level process, right? First, you need to do some technical due diligence and determine what's suitable for your specific firm. Then you run an RFP process with different vendors and maybe do a POC. And then you have to negotiate legal terms, and that's always fun as soon as the lawyers get involved. So anyways, I think you get the picture, right? And going back to what I said earlier about considering the different facets when capturing communications data, does your vendor, do they have the ability to address not only your needs of today, but also your needs of tomorrow? And do they offer the flexibility to alleviate a lot of these procurement challenges? So I think firms, they have to push vendors to have these kind of bundle models or all you can eat models, which ultimately will result in cost savings for the firm, not only from a pure capital perspective, but in terms of resourcing effort. So I think those are things that can't be overlooked. And as we're in this world of just constant evolving tech, that whole procurement process in terms of how do firms stay ahead, and how do they leverage these new technologies as opposed to seeing them as a hindrance? And to me, the procurement process is a big piece of that.
Thank you, Garrett. I think, ironically, we've given our listeners a lot of high quality data to sort through from this podcast. Thank you for your insights, some really valid points there, and a lot to take away.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Jay.
So thank you to Garrett, and thank you to all of our guests from across this series for sharing their expert insights with us, and thank you for listening. Our recently launched Industry Insights Compliant Communications 2024 report explores how compliance professionals across the industry are dealing with a range of challenges, from off-channel comms to social media risks and the emerging risks and rewards of AI. We'll be back after the summer with more episodes, so stay tuned and make sure you get your compliance insights right from the source.